I stood in the doorway of the bridal suite, staring at my reflection in the floor-length mirror. My dress was perfect, the veil delicate, but my heart felt like it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. My parents had just texted me a cold, final message. "We won't be attending. You need to learn humility." Their boycott was meant to break me, to force me onto my knees to beg for their approval on the biggest day of my life. They expected tears. They expected me to cancel everything. Instead, I took a deep breath, walked down that aisle, and stood beside the man who loved me unconditionally. But when the reception started and the tension reached its peak, my husband took the microphone. What he revealed in front of every guest didn't just expose my parents' cruelty, it completely shattered their reputation forever. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Clara. I'm 28 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my life was micromanaged by parents who treated affection like a business transaction. Growing up in our wealthy suburb, image was everything. My father, a high-powered corporate attorney, and my mother, a prominent socialite, viewed me less as a daughter and more as a status symbol to polish. I was expected to marry into another prominent family, secure a trust fund lifestyle, and play my designated role without question. Then I met Julian. Julian was a skilled union carpenter, a hardworking, honest man who built custom furniture and had a heart bigger than anyone I'd ever known. He didn't care about designer labels or country club memberships. When I brought him home, the air turned ice cold. My father barely looked up from his drink, and my mother openly scoffed at Julian's work boots. To them, my falling in love with a working-class man wasn't just a disappointment. It was an act of high treason against our family's social standing. The ultimatum came swift and merciless: break off the engagement immediately, or be completely cut off. But for the first time in my life, I refused to obey. When we didn't back down, my parents launched a campaign to completely destroy our special day. My mother personally called every relative, cousin, and family friend, spinning a toxic narrative that I was making a ruinous mistake out of pure rebellion. She convinced them that attending our wedding would only enable my childish defiance. She framed their boycott not as an act of cruelty, but as a necessary lesson in humility. One by one, the decline notices started rolling in from people I had known my entire life. Uncles who used to bounce me on their knees sent cold, formal regrets. Aunts who promised to help me pick my dress suddenly stopped answering my calls. By the morning of the wedding, the psychological warfare reached its agonizing peak. As I sat in the bridal suite, surrounded by quiet hairstylists, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. It was short, precise, and calculated to break me. "We won't be attending. You need to learn humility." Tears welled in my eyes as I stared at the screen, realizing they would rather publicly humiliate me than support my happiness. Walking into the venue, my knees felt weak under the weight of my heavy dress. As the music began and the chapel doors swung open, every eye turned toward me. I forced myself to keep my head held high as I took those long steps down the aisle, but I couldn't stop my gaze from flickering toward the front row. There they were, 4 empty mahogany chairs, sitting like an open wound in the middle of the room. A wave of embarrassment washed over me, and the quiet murmurs of the guests echoed in my ears. But then I looked up and met Julian's eyes. Standing at the altar, he gave me a subtle, steady nod and a warm smile that instantly grounded me. In that moment, the emptiness of those seats vanished. We exchanged our vows with quiet dignity, proving that our love didn't need their permission to exist. As the dinner drew to a close, Julian cleared his throat and stepped toward the front of the room, taking the microphone. The room grew still, the clinking of silverware fading into a tense silence. Everyone expected a standard groom's speech, a few heartwarming anecdotes, a heartfelt thank you to the guests, and a tribute to his new bride. Instead, Julian's eyes swept over the room before settling directly on the empty mahogany chairs in the front row. He didn't look angry. His expression was calm, controlled, and deeply deliberate. "I know many of you have been wondering why Clara's parents aren't sitting here tonight," Julian began, his voice echoing clearly through the speaker system. You've probably heard the rumors that they stayed away to teach Clara a lesson in humility, or because they disapproved of my background. A collective murmur rippled through the audience as guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. I think it's time everyone in this room knew the actual truth, Julian continued, pulling a small folded paper from his jacket pocket. Their boycott wasn't about values or humility. It was about control, money, and a cover-up that went too far. 6 months ago, Clara's father approached her with legal documents, Julian said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. He demanded she sign over her late grandmother's trust fund, a bequest intended solely for her future, to bail out his failing law firm after a series of disastrous investments. When Clara realized the money was being used to cover up his financial mismanagement, she stood her ground and refused. Julian held up a printed stack of financial statements and email threads for the room to see. When intimidation failed, her parents decided to use this wedding as a weapon. They attempted to isolate Clara, turning family against her to force her submission. But they made one critical mistake. They forgot that financial fraud leaves a paper trail. A gasping silence blanketed the hall. Guests stared in utter shock as Julian placed the papers back onto the podium. Before stepping up here, I emailed these exact bank transfers, audit reports, and coercive messages to every relative sitting in this room, and every single person who chose to boycott tonight. The truth is now out in the open. Within seconds, quiet phone notifications began chiming across the reception hall. Relatives pulled out their devices, their eyes widening in disbelief as they scrolled through the undeniable proof of my father's fraud. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The subtle judgment that had hovered over Julian and me vanished, replaced by collective outrage directed straight at my parents. By the time we cut our wedding cake, my phone was vibrating uncontrollably on the head table. Dozens of frantic text messages and missed calls flooded in from my parents. Their carefully curated reputation in our social circle was crumbling in real time as aunts, uncles, and family friends began calling them out for their deceit. The very relatives who had boycotted our wedding were now turning on my parents, demanding answers. The elaborate trap they had set to publicly humiliate me had snapped shut on them instead, exposing their true nature to the world. I looked down at my phone, watching their names flash across the screen one last time, before taking a deep breath and hitting block. For the first time in 28 years, I was completely free from their manipulation. They had spent decades trying to teach me a lesson in humility, but in the end, it was their own arrogance that brought them down. Julian and I left the reception that night not as victims of a family boycott, but as a united front. In the months that followed, we built a life grounded in true honesty, respect, and unconditional love, a real family that no amount of money or status could ever buy. Now, I'm curious to hear from all of you. What would you have done if your parents boycotted your wedding to force your submission? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.